Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for giving me permission to talk to this conference. Don was very kind. I'm not an expert on measurement at all, but I want to raise my concerns about what's going on and see how people will respond. So I want to challenge the assumption that diagnostic test scores provide a neutral snapshot of mathematical competence. And what I'd like to do is, in case any of you are not aware of maths anxiety and its prevalence, just to raise that, to consider its impact on the validity and usefulness of diagnostic maths testing, and to consider some implications and choices. And my thesis is that maths anxiety is widely acknowledged as a psychological barrier to maths engagement and learning and performance, and yet its implications for the validity of diagnostic assessment are not sufficiently considered. And in case you don't know, there's a lot of literature about maths anxiety, but in general, we tend to focus on Ashcraft's definition because it's short, concise, and pithy. A feeling of tension, apprehension, or fear that interferes with maths performance. And that definition's been in the literature for over 20 years, but maths fear, maths anxiety has been written about for over 100 years. And it results in lower attainment and impact on working memory, amongst other things relevant to today. So just so that you know, the brain is constantly seeking to distinguish challenge from threat to well-being, and it doesn't always distinguish between physical and social threats, such as being left behind, humiliated, or shouted at. And previous threats are remembered. So when the brain subconsciously perceives a threat, it responds by shifting quickly into fight or flight mode, at least initially. And Dan Siegel has a lovely hand model of the brain to illustrate this very vividly to people who haven't thought about it before, that the amygdala, the alarm system, is represented by the thumb, and the fingernails represent the part where we're doing our mathematical thinking. And in the normal run of events, our brain is all working together really nicely. But then if this fight-flight mechanism kicks in, effectively the maths part of the brain goes offline and the hand flips open and the brain goes blank. So the key message that we have to take on board as assessors is that the brain can't panic and think effectively at the same time. So maths anxiety affects testing. It distorts tests intended to measure your underlying maths knowledge, and it may reflect the level of anxiety as much as or more than actual conceptual understanding. And this comment has come from a learner talking to me about doing maths tests. The mechanisms for the effect of maths anxiety on your assessment include this working memory being reduced, avoidance-driven disengagement behaviours, altered item-level response processes, and shifts in self-efficacy that influence test-taking behaviour. High anxiety can disrupt the ability to recall stored maths facts and procedures, and the learners might experience the brain going completely blank when it flips open, and feeling completely stupid. And if we already teach them about this, they will know how to handle it. But if it happens to them in a test, they just won't be able to proceed for quite some time. Maths anxiety consumes critical cognitive resources, specifically working memory, that are needed to solve complex problems. Anxious thoughts and safeguarding physiology occupy the mental space and give less capacity for processing mathematical information. So your brain's behaving as if there's a tiger in the room and is not focused at all on the mathematics. In order to avoid the situation or get out of it as quickly as possible, students are likely to try and quickly answer a question, or they may just answer it incorrectly because they're not thinking clearly. So anxious students often perform below their actual potential. So the diagnostic test may indicate low ability when the student actually understands the concepts, when their brain is back together again. I've got a PhD student whose thesis is called I see it differently when I calm down. So if you can calm down, or if you're not triggered in the first place by the circumstances of the diagnostic test, then you're more likely to show what you actually understand rather than show blank progress. An example of an awareness of this comes from the NFER, the National Foundation for Education Research, which emphasises the need to draw conclusions from test data in an appropriate way, considering other factors that may influence test scores, and that includes their emotional and psychological factors. And I don't always see that happening when I see people talking about diagnostic assessment. And the Cambridge Centre for Neuroscience and Education, which, for those of you who haven't thought about this already, have seen for a long time the relationship between maths anxiety and performance in maths tests. I really apologise if I'm speaking to people who are already aware of this problem, but part of my role in the Mathematical Resilience Network is to raise awareness globally of the impact of maths anxiety on our learners and our teaching. There are two ways of thinking about what goes on. Is it low attainment that triggers anxiety, or is it anxiety that triggers low attainment? Just for today, we're looking at the debilitating anxiety model, where the link between maths anxiety and performance is driven by the anxiety's devastating consequences, particularly on recalling maths skills that may be completely familiar to them when their brain is working completely. So unassessed maths anxiety potentially leads to misclassification of learners' needs and thereby inappropriate instructional decisions. And working with FE resit students in the UK, we also work with teachers and educators around the world with the Maths Resilience Network. We find that a lot of people give the students, because they're not children anymore, 16-year-olds, a diagnostic test, and then they start from the absolute beginning, and they don't give the learners credit for what they know already, and they end up patronising the learners. Whereas if the learners understand they've got to calm down, they're capable of so much more than we think they are. Timed diagnostic tests can severely disadvantage students. The pressure of time constrains the working memory even further, so there's not a lot of it left, and makes the gap between what is understood and what is demonstrated in the test even bigger. The impact is stronger on complex problems requiring higher order reasoning because of the amount of working memory that's gone missing temporarily, rather than if it's simple rote calculations, which the brain might just be able to do while it's running or trying to get you to run away from this imaginary tiger. And tests administered in high-stakes, stressful environment will lead lower, less accurate results than those in a relaxed one-on-one or computer-based setting, unless there's computer anxiety as well, which complicates the issue and can be also addressed by familiarity. So let's look quickly at the implications for the design, interpretation, ethical use of diagnostic assessments in the face of prevalent maths anxiety. I've just got a few more comments to make, and then I'm looking forward to the discussion about this. But one of the things that we could start doing, instead of giving the learners a test at the beginning of a new course, is to give the students the test paper and invite them to colour code the questions. So just using R for red makes me panic, O for orange, I could have a go at this, but I might make some mistakes. G for green, I'm confident I can do this, rather than actually doing the paper. And some colleges in the UK have started using that practice, but we haven't written any papers about that yet. The second solution, which is well established in the literature, is to ask students to spend some time thinking through and writing about their anxiety before a test. And this externalization of worries has been shown to free up mental space to focus on the task in hand rather than the anxiety. So that works sometimes. The third solution, which is very exciting in our work on maths resilience, is reported by a young lad in year 8, so he'd be about 12, And he said, so I've got maths anxiety, but I've managed to double my score in the maths test. And what he did was to use what we call the mathematical resilience toolkit, which I'll briefly introduce to you. So it includes the hand model of the brain. It also includes those three colours, red, amber, green, and being aware that there are, if you like, two kinds of anxiety. There's productive anxiety, which is involved when anything's new and unfamiliar and you're learning, and that's a very special space to be in, but not good to be in a test situation. But if you have the pressure, time pressure off, and you feel you can have a go, then that functions. And then the red panic zone. But then more importantly for this lad, there's relaxation breathing. And that's based in Benson's work in a book called The Relaxation Response. And what the lad did in his test was he realised he was panicking and had gone into his red zone, and he stopped the test paper and he took some time out to do relaxation breathing. And then he was able to continue and focus on the questions he could do, and the panic didn't take over the whole test time. And so as a result, he got a second bite at the test, and that's how he doubled his score. So in summary, my provocation is that maths anxiety acts as a noise in assessment, often masking what you're actually trying to measure, that diagnostic assessment should at least be conducted in low pressure supportive environments, and that it's vital that the affective state, the emotional state, that the panic levels are evaluated alongside the cognitive abilities. Otherwise, I think you do not have a valid measure of maths ability or attainment. So I'd love to see what happens in the discussion now that I've shared my argument with you. Thank you very much. Everybody's on mute except for me.
Sorry, Sue. Here we go.
Hi, Dawn.
Hi.
So I think at my own institution, when we were implementing our diagnostic, I could remember my own childhood math anxiety or anxiety about test taking. So I think we were cognizant, or I was cognizant, to try and implement some of the things you suggested. One, that it's untimed. Two, students can take it wherever they want. You know, in Starbucks with lots of noise, in their bedroom, in their, jammies, just sort of removing that sort of setting. But I also think the other thing that really helps, not only with anxiety, but perhaps with students being dishonest, is they can take it again. And so it's not this one-shot deal, because I think that notion of I can only do it once, and it might be timed, and I have to sit with you, makes it explosive in terms of what could happen to their brain. So, how can we, as an institution, remove as many of those things, but then also make sure we're still getting valid and reliable results? And so I think, at least for us, as when we were implementing 17, 18 years ago, we took a lot of this to heart in sort of our design of how it went forward. But I truly acknowledge and appreciate all the work that you're looking at, because yes, it is really unclear what we are measuring otherwise. But that also can be true when it's non-adaptive or other, we often don't know what we're measuring. Any test, we often don't know what we're measuring. And so good test design in itself is important as well. But thank you.
I think that Ruth across the room.
Thanks. Thanks very much for this provocation. I think it's really interesting and super important to be thinking about. So, I mean, firstly, I think you just preface what I'm going to say by saying that, yeah, I think the way we generally test mathematics is terrible. Diagnostic, or the way we assess it even in our institutions as students are progressing. It's like this totally contrived high stress situation in which I mean, actually work using mathematics in the world, you're never going to be there, not allowed to consult a textbook or talk to anyone. It's a time limit. So it's just a ridiculous system we've got. But with that being said, given that that is the system we're in, we're basically making quite sure that there will always be a tiger in the room whenever the student is being assessed on maths. So I suppose if we're trying to diagnose how they're going to cope with later testing in the university context, in which there is going to be the tiger, then maybe we are getting a better sense of that if we have the tiger in the diagnostic test, although we're measuring something else entirely than actually their competence with mathematics, but that's all we ever measure. So
At least we're consistent.
because they could do maths in their pajamas in bed, listening to jazz and whatever. They're put in their most ideal space, and we could get some data from that diagnostic test. But when they write their first year exam, they're going to be in a packed room full of people, very stressed. I guess I don't know. I'm not really sure where I'm going with this, but just yeah.
I'd like to challenge that, if I may. Is the chair Anita?
Oh, yes,
Sure.
please go ahead.
Hi, may I? So if we're testing their exam performance, that's one thing, but aren't we also talking about diagnostic testing here and what we need to teach? So I think what we need to teach is different from preparing people for exams, although that's part of what we need to teach. And I think something like the toolkit or the pre-writing or some strategies for making the learners aware that they might underperform in a test situation and that there are things that can be done about it should be part of our curriculum. But also the diagnostic part of the assessment, what have you understood and what have you not understood, has to be separate, I think. But that's down to you to argue with me.
If that's okay.
Yeah, later.
My question's a bit more about the prevalence of maths anxiety. I have a very limited experience, and I know that it's a very real and debilitating issue for a lot of people. But aren't people who have got severe math anxiety quite self-selecting, and that they tend to stay away from mathematical heavy courses? And should we be thinking about the cohort that we're assessing at the same time as considering the math anxiety? It's more a question of do you have an idea of the prevalence in different disciplines, I suppose, is what I'm getting at.
It's more likely, it's higher prevalence in disciplines where the learners have started out with a narrative preference rather than a logical preference. So, for example, if students choose psychology because they're interested in people, it's quite likely that they will have some form of math, mostly statistics anxiety. People who have chosen to do a maths degree might have a different kind of anxiety. I'm working with our maths department on presentation anxiety, which is also amenable to the sort of resilience toolkit stuff that we've been producing. But yes, in general, it is discipline specific. In Warwick, for example, we're widening participation, and I worked with one learner who scored 40% in his test, and we went through the concepts that I've just quickly run through with you, and he got 80% in his next test. So it's quite often that they believe they're not included, they believe they don't belong, they've had bad prior experiences. The whole message that these bad experiences can be overcome, that you can be included even in a maths or a STEM subject. But an awful lot of the time, for example, in psychology, geography, those kind of disciplines, students think they've left maths behind, and they're suddenly given it, and then maths or stats becomes the problem unexpectedly.
Sounds like it's quite difficult to tease it out sometimes from other anxieties or other, I don't know, imposter syndrome or other sort of aspects that may be hindering the performance.
Absolutely. But there are maths and stats anxiety tests that we can use to assess the scale of the problem, as well as trying to ameliorate the likelihood, the way that the first responder suggested.
Thank you.
Right, let's go on to Oluwaseyi.
Yeah, thank you, Anita. Yeah, nice presentation there. My question is all about how do we shift away from measuring the level of anxiety to measuring the anxiety of mathematics itself? Because when you shift away from measuring the mathematics anxiety, then, like in your presentation, you said it will affect the validity. So, as an assessment and as assessor myself, how do I focus?
Versus what? I'm not sure I understand. Do you mean the level of anxiety compared with the actual level of maths ability?
Yes, yes,
Ah, mm.
yes.
One of the things I'd love to get across very strongly is that very able students also suffer from maths anxiety. And so even if they're attaining high, they possibly could be attaining higher if their maths anxiety was addressed. So attainment is reduced across the spectrum. That's a really important point. Thank you. We can measure the level of maths anxiety or stats anxiety using these various tests that are available. I can send to Don to circulate possibly one of the chapters from the Maths Resilience book, which explains the various tools there are to measure maths anxiety and maths resilience, that was produced by Tom Hunt, who's a psychologist working in Derby in the UK. So there are lots of tests around. And that's one of the suggestions that NFER and others are making, is that we measure the level of maths anxiety and the measure attainment, and then find other ways, one of these three that I've just suggested to you, to measure the level of attainment separately. So an untimed test, a test where students don't have to answer the questions, they colour code the question as to what effect it's having on them, and they report that to you through the colour coding, or writing about their anxiety beforehand and you collecting that in and seeing from their stories how anxious they are and how much that might be affected. But what I'm trying to do here is raise a new area of research within the diagnostic testing and support arena, because this is under-researched, and I think it's a big area that needs us to do much better. Because otherwise we're wasting a lot of resources going over maths that the students have already understood, when all we need to do is get them calmed down and they'll be able to perform much better. Does that answer your question, Oluwaseyi? Thank you so much.
Lovely. Tina, go ahead with your question.
I have a comment and question, if that's okay. I really like to see the maths anxiety tool, so I will be really appreciate if you can share it after the session, because we're in the process. We not even exactly in the process, but we want to involve maths anxiety tool before our diagnostic tool, because it's really important for us. Because at Aston, we used to do it all formative diagnostic test, which the aim was just to define their level, and we give extra support the one whose level is not in the level that they can confidently follow the model. Even then, they are really, stressed about it. The first thing in the welcoming week, we're asking them to do a maths test, so they get really stressed about it. However, I am physically there with Gareth, my colleague that we present earlier. We are the one who's running the diagnostic quiz together, and we convince them that this is just for them and for us to make them aware what they remembered and what they have forgotten, and not to worry. It's not going to affect anything. It's not going to affect their grades, or if they do really bad, we're not going to kick them out of the university. They got accepted. This is just to support them. But still then anxiety affect their ability. So we can't really define who we really need to help, because we try to help somebody who actually doesn't need help with the maths knowledge, but needs help with maths anxiety.
Absolutely.
And also it's important for us while doing the maths anxiety test to be sure that they're confident to use the technological tool, because that's sometimes is the problem, not the anxiety, not the knowledge, but actually using the tool to enter the answer there, because they can't do it. So we want to look that part of it as well. But what is my question now? Recently, the beginning of 2025-26, one of the model, we have two models in the engineering and two maths model, and one of them, diagnostic, is formative. However, the second one, we introduce and make it the part of the model, and it's become summative. Even though they have unlimited access and attempt that they can try, it's stressing them because they can fail 10 times, and each time they have the level is the same but different question. So how can we be sure that we use the anxiety test in both summative and the formative way of the diagnostic, and we get some result and we get aware to help our student? Do you know any tool who can do both at the same time, or are we imagining that we're going to able to do an anxiety questionnaire, then we will get our answers?
Okay, so my experience over many years is that once we start talking about the anxiety problem with the students, things start to get a little bit easier, because they assume they're the only one unless we talk about it. And Brené Brown, the shame researcher in the States, talks about the shame you carry and also they start to feel that they're stupid rather than panicking. So that hand model, you're not stupid, you're panicking. Panic is temporary, stupid is permanent, not unless you have a growth mindset. So we can change the dialogue to say, if you calm down, you'll be fine. And that makes a big difference to the learners. So I think the problem is that you start with a maths test before you've had a chance to have that conversation with the students. That's going to be a disaster.
Yeah.
Because they're already, you're reinforcing the injury. One of my colleagues at AQA talked about the walking wounded. So some of these youngsters who come for resit classes are wounded psychologically, as if they've been through a battle. Yeah. And you don't immediately put them through that kind of condition. So that's why I've been trying to suggest to the colleges that you give them the test paper and use the colours instead of the actual answering of the questions. Don't answer the question, just tell me what effect does each of these questions have on you, and use the colour coding that I've suggested. I can share the slides with pleasure. And I've got lots of articles out there, as Anita mentioned, that we can read and catch up with each other. I'm happy to be communicated separately, but I think if we convey these tools, the hand model of the brain and the colour coding, and also the whole notion of the relaxation response. I've got into red, I can get out. If I panic, I can calm down, and just really looking at how that process works, that trigger. So the fight flight is autonomous, and then the calming down is autonomous. You can control that part with your breathing and with having something to eat. You can go to the toilet, have a toilet break in an exam. There's all sorts of ways of calming it back down and doubling your score, as the young person said. So I think starting with a test is not setting up the right environment. I think using the color coding approach to the test paper, and also asking them about the maths anxiety. And it could be that you do that through a maths anxiety test, or you could do that through collecting their stories on a piece of paper. What are your adverse experiences of mathematics? What are your good experiences of mathematics? And how do you handle it when you get anxious? So you can collect narrative accounts. You don't have to measure it, but as I say, I'll happily share the various. There are lots of tests around for different age groups. The one we use is very dated in our group, but it's simple and it's only 10 questions, and it gives us a score that we know what to do with. but Tom Hunt's got more updated ones in his article, and maybe the whole group of you can recommend which one you would like to use develop some research in this area. Does that answer all your questions, Pinar, or have I missed something?
What was my actual question? We have to do the diagnostic in the welcoming week because we have to catch those ones who really has a gap in their math skills. Then we can provide the support. But we want
so why don't we use the colour coding idea? Why do we have to actually measure their maths?
That's what I was thinking. Maybe we need to introduce. You mean with the diagnostic?
Yeah.
Because it's online Blackboard quiz, maybe we can offer to do it on paper if they feel that they will be more successful for the color coding, or I'm not sure if we can do it online.
You could ask, yes, you could give people, you could say to the students at the beginning, we recognise that if you have maths anxiety, it will reduce your score. What we're trying to do is not prepare you for exams, as somebody else said. We're trying to actually assess what you know and what you don't know. So if you prefer, you can have a paper version and just tell us what each question makes you feel, and whether you feel you've got mastery of that question, or whether it's something you're working on, whether it's something you've never done before. Yeah. And it'd be interesting to know, as a research project, how many students opt for the paper version. And so all of this is worthy research, I think. And in each cohort that we're working with, it'll be a different proportion. In Warwick, across the people we measured, 1 in 3 had quite significant maths anxiety, and that was from different disciplines, including the engineering group and also the arts and humanities groups. And I can separate those down by discipline and do some more work on that with colleagues. But I think if we can give that option, that might be the easy way. What I'm worried about hearing, and I hope my colleagues will agree with me, is we don't want the computer to drive our safeguarding of the learners. And I'm presenting this as a psychological safeguarding issue as well as a validity issue. But for you today, I've got it as a validity issue. But there's no point in us harming students right at the beginning of the course, because that's going to set them back for the rest of the year. So it's a safeguarding issue as well. Does that make sense?
Yeah, definitely. We will try I like the idea to tell us, I feel confident, but I will need support on those type of the things, rather than giving them quiz and they can't do it. But so don't recommend to put maths anxiety before we do the diagnostic, because that was what we were thinking, to measure their maths anxiety before we give them the test, and then according to that change our approach, maybe, as you said, the color coding.
Well, I think that would be interesting as well, to give them and to give them the maths anxiety test, and then offer alternatives to the ones who score high.
Yeah.
Because maths anxiety is on a scale, and also it's triggered by different situations. So you only get a rough idea from measuring the level of overall anxiety, obviously.
Thank you.
But do keep in touch, because that sounds really interesting.
I will definitely. I want to, contact with a couple of more colleagues to ask about how we can improve, because it's similar, but we don't have personal feedback to student. We have the general feedback, but I really like to, implement a tool who can give a personal feedback to each student. And I really like the idea of the color coding, because that's what we need. The main idea of the one cohort is to define what they need during the first week before they find everything really difficult, before they lose the track. So I will definitely contact. Thank you very much. So
thank you, Pinar.
So do you have any opinions on the different types of tests? I mean, a lot of us are running diagnostic tests that are adaptive. So once a student answers, the questions in the test are set up in a knowledge map, so that some questions are harder than others, and you're asked a question. If you get that correct, then it's assumed that you can do any of the easier questions, and so you'll only be asked the harder ones, and vice versa. If you get it wrong, it's assumed you can't answer the harder ones, so you'll only be asked the easier questions. So students never really see the whole test paper or the whole set of questions. In fact, they don't answer the whole set of questions. do you have any feeling on whether that has more of an effect on maths anxiety than a more traditional form of test?
No, and I'd love to see some research on that.
Yeah.
So I don't know that adaptive assessment always asks a harder question. It might switch to.
It could switch to another stream. Yeah.
The tendency is probably that they get harder, but not necessarily that it's gonna like. Yeah, I think it's still an interesting question. So how
Perception also, student perception. Oh, I'm getting harder question, so I'm getting easier questions.
But it could go both ways, right? If you're getting easier questions, that means you're doing poorly.
Exactly, that's the
Harder questions, depending on what the student understands the nature of the thing.
I would say that if you start a panic off, if the student goes into the red zone with that harder question, then they may not be able to answer the easier questions they could answer if they weren't in the red zone, if that makes sense.
Yep.
So that needs bearing in mind, because it takes time to get out of the panic space back into the, you know, brain put back together again space. It takes a bit of breathing or a few seconds, you know, of awareness or something just to calm down again, and then have another go at what's supposed to be. Because, you know, quite often you get situations in class where the kids ask, what, 7 8s? Don't know. Well, what's 3 8s? I don't know, you know, and the, you know, the rabbit in the headlights comes on, and you don't get anything out of the learner at all. So I think, yeah, there are issues that need to be considered about using that. But I, as I said, I've got no experience of actually doing it.
Okay.
Can I do one comment?
Yeah.
Sure. I'm thinking back to what you said about harm, and also the fact that we remember anxiety or these stressful situations. In some sense, a lot of what we're measuring could be prior harm. You know, they already had to take an exit exam or a university admissions exam, and all of these have a quantitative section, you know, all the time. Or they had a bad math teacher who was, you know, belittled them, or they didn't get into the university they wanted. And so by the time we're trying to give them a diagnostic to truly help them not be a barrier, which sort of all the prior harm was that developed this math anxiety, we're trying to actually help them launch into success. We want to have an understanding of what it is you know and what you can do, so we can help you move forward and be successful, versus all other prior situations seem to be more of, I want to know what you can't do, so I don't put you in that room. And so I think that there is this sort of notion that what that math anxiety might be at that moment was developed long before we showed up. And so how do we turn the narrative around in terms of just the messaging of what it is we're trying to accomplish? We want to know what to teach you. We want to know a good fit. We need to know what supports. So I think that in addition to just the nature of the diagnostic as a tool, how do we frame the situation so the student understands the purpose? Because it's really a different purpose than almost every other test they have ever taken, which was a barrier exam, or to keep you out, or to grant you access to this. So I think I don't know where my comment's going, but the prior
how we sell it, it's really how we
sell it. How do we make sure that they understand that we're here to support, we're here to help? And because that in itself can lower the anxiety if you have a real understanding of what the goal is and the purpose.
Yeah, I think this is what the Maths Resilience Network is trying to do around the world, is to pass this message on. You're not stupid, you're panicking. You know, you've had bad experiences, you've experienced psychological harm. For most people, it's the kind of harm that you can self-manage through these breathing and other techniques. Occasionally 1-2% might need to go for therapy because their trauma or their level of general anxiety is so big. But most of us, with this little bit of psychoeducation, can actually help the learners help themselves, and there aren't enough psychologists to go around. So we call this toolkit and the use of the toolkit psychoeducation, just an understanding that your brain is brilliant. It's growing new connections all the time, provided you're in your green and your orange zone. But if you're in your red zone, the neurons aren't firing because the defensive mechanisms have kicked in. And that you have to tell us if you're in your red zone. And and if you're in your orange zone, you might be feeling nervous because it's new and it's challenging. There's a whole load of work on challenge and threat, and there's a paper we could look at called Turning Butterflies into Bows to try and understand when it's nervous anxiety and when it's panic anxiety, you know, because sometimes productive anxiety, as I say, because you're given something new to do, it makes the brain engaged and interesting, and neurons fire even quicker. So a little bit of knowledge of that, and I do lots of podcasts and whatever to try and explain this to as many students as possible. What I'd like, I've just told Pearson this morning, is to have a conversation with a student who's got maths anxiety and to make that more publicly available. But I think what we've got to do, and the reason for existence of the Maths Resilience Network, is to help people understand this key message. You're not stupid, you're panicking. You can calm down, and if you calm down and get into the orange and green zones, your maths brain will grow, and it will grow at a rate of knots if it's given the right levels of challenge and support. And it's not about wrapping the students in cotton wool and being worried about frightening them. It's about making sure that they can tell you whether they feel challenged or whether they feel threatened. So that's how we're trying to change the conversation.
No, this conversation is so interesting. I'm going to just say, if anyone wants to take a break, we are on our break time, but we do have till 20 past. So if you need to run and take a break, do. But if you want to stay and hear what Jason is saying, then Jason, please go ahead. Okay, I'm going to suggest, Jason, that maybe you type in the chat. Because when you unmute, we get a rather loud buzz sound come in. So I suggest maybe we can talk through the chat. Okay, and there's the chat. Yeah, there was bad feedback. Okay, so I'm going to say we're on a break, but we will be coming back for collaboration. So more chance for questions at 20 past. Thank you so much, Sue. I feel we haven't quite finished yet. So if you're able to stay, that would be lovely. But otherwise, thank you so much. I'm sure people will want to be getting in touch. Yes, thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Sue. That was great.
And I'll send some papers. Thanks, Don. Thanks, Anita, and all the best with the rest of your conference. You take care now.